Today we are going to talk about macroevolution. By the end of this video, you should understand what macroevolution is and how speciation occurs. So first we need to break down the word macroevolution. We learned that micro meant small. So what do you think macro means? Well, hopefully you said large. So macroevolution, macro means large, evolution means change over time. So this means large changes over time. So macro, like we said, means large, and evolution means change over time. So macroevolution is when many small changes, which we call microevolution, accumulate or add up. After this happens, two organisms from a founder species or original species can no longer mate with each other. In other words, the two organisms can no longer produce offspring that are fertile together. So let's look at an example of macroevolution. Here's our founder species on the left-hand side. Over time, small changes. Small things change. So in this example, the Amaki and Neo finches evolve from the same founder species. However, they become so different that they cannot produce offspring together. So remember, mating is the action of animals coming together to produce offspring or babies. In other words, mating is breeding. So that's the process that where sexually reproducing organisms make an offspring. So let's look at some examples. First, take a second and look at these spiders. What are some similarities that you notice? What are some differences? Next, I want you to think, are these spiders a part of the same species? Essentially, can these spiders breed with each other and then produce viable offspring who are also fertile? So think about that for a second. What evidence do you see in these pictures that make you think they're a part of the same species? What evidence do you see that make you think maybe they are no longer a part of the same species? All right, let's look at the answer. So these spiders look very different, but all of these spiders are actually members of the same species. These spiders can mate with each other because they are members of the same species. The differences in these spiders are not the result of macroevolution. So for example, those spiders have all different colors. You can think about this like the difference between eye color in human beings. Human beings have all different eye colors. I have green eyes, my fiance has brown eyes, my sister has brown eyes, my grandpa has blue eyes, right? But all of those people are able to mate and produce viable offspring no matter what color your eyes are. So these individuals, just like the spiders, are all a part of the same species, and speciation has not occurred. Let's look at these friends. It's a little bit of a blurry picture, but do you think that these friends, these bird friends, are part of the same species or not part of the same species? Well, they are actually not a part of the same species. And while these birds look identical, they actually are not. And one of the reasons that they are not able to breed with each other, and they are separate species, is that they have very different breeding songs. And these breeding songs prevent them from breeding with one another. These birds are an example of macroevolution because the changes of microevolution have added up so much that these individuals can no longer mate with each other. So those birds are an example of speciation or macroevolution. So here's what you need to know. Macroevolution is microevolution plus time. And those things added together lead to macroevolution. So let's talk real quickly about what is a species. We talked a little bit about it in the previous slides, but let's be super explicit about our definition of a species. Fertile first means that an organism is able to conceive young, which means produce offspring. And species are organisms that can mate or breed and produce viable or fertile offspring. Speciation is an event that produces two or more separate species, and speciation occurs because of macroevolution. So one example of this that I think it's really important to bring up briefly is that sometimes different species are able to mate or breed. But those organisms, when they produce an offspring, that offspring is not fertile. So like ligers and tions, right? Those are tiger and lion breed mixes. While those animals are able to reproduce and produce offspring, those children, those lions and those lions, those ligers and taions are not able to produce offspring. Another really famous example is of mules. Mules are the offspring of male donkeys and female horses, and horses or donkeys are different species. While they're able to produce a mule, that mule cannot reproduce. So here is a good example of some cladograms, which we're going to learn about soon. These things over here are speciation events that change those species. Here's our common ancestor. We have genetic variation that leads to these different organisms. That is what speciation is. So to kind of review, we have microevolution, that's variation within species, and those produce these spiders that can mate. We have macroevolution, which is variation between species, and those birds cannot mate. So what are some things that happen that make organisms no longer to be able to produce offspring together? Well, this is because of isolation. And reproductive isolation means that a species can no longer mate with each other. There are two types of reproductive isolation. One is behavioral and the other is geographic. Behavioral isolation is differences in the organism's behaviors. For example, in frogs only respond to mating calls of the same members of their specific species. That's why when you go to a pond or a lake, you'll hear a cacophony of all sorts of different frog sounds, because each one of those species has a specific call. We also see this a lot with birds. Birds have specific mating calls, mating rituals, and these very specific mating calls and mating rituals lead to different species, right? They don't breed with each other. So behavioral isolation is when populations of the same species begin to develop different behaviors that are not preferred by members in another population, and that leads to those populations no longer breeding with each other because of this behavioral isolation. Next, we have geographic isolation. Geographic isolation is what it would sound like, right? Reproductive isolation that's caused by physical barriers, like mountains, rivers, or in this case of these cute little snails, a log. So geographic isolation is when populations of the same species become separate species due to the physical barriers, like rivers or mountains. So it's the end of this video. You should understand the difference between microevolution and macroevolution. You should understand the difference between different species and how organisms create different species. You should also understand the difference between geographic isolation and behavioral isolation.